The figure of Carpocrates, a 2nd century Gnostic teacher in Alexandria, is a fascinating and contentious subject within the history of early Christian thought. Primarily known through the critical accounts of early church fathers, Carpocrates and his followers, the Carpocratians, were accused of a radical antinomianism, a belief that spiritual enlightenment liberated them from the constraints of moral and civil law. This led to scandalous allegations of libertine behavior, including communal wives and the supposed necessity of experiencing all possible earthly conditions regardless of their moral implications. The accusations of libertinism leveled against the Carpocratians by early church fathers paint a stark picture of a Gnostic sect that fundamentally rejected the constraints of conventional morality and civil law. These critics, our primary historical evidence of Carpocrates' teachings, allege that the Carpocratians embraced the belief that spiritual enlightenment freed them from legal and ethical obligations. This supposed freedom was then translated into scandalous practices, including the sharing of wives and indiscriminate engagement in any and all actions, regardless of their perceived sinfulness within broader society. The Church Fathers presented this as a dangerous perversion of spiritual liberty, a descent into moral chaos justified by a heretical theology that prioritized individual spiritual perfection over communal and divine law. The inflammatory nature of these accusations, particularly the charge of communal wives, underscores the profound challenge that Carpocratian beliefs pose to the burgeoning Orthodox Christian understanding of marriage and family, as well as the established social norms of the Roman world. By allegedly advocating for unrestrained behavior and the rejection of inherent evil, the Carpocratians were portrayed as a significant threat to the moral fabric of society. However, it remains crucial to acknowledge the inherent bias within these accounts, penned by those actively seeking to discredit and suppress Gnostic movements. The absence of Carpocratian writings necessitates a cautious interpretation of these criticisms, recognizing the potential for exaggeration and misrepresentation in the biased efforts of the early church fathers. The radical interpretation of freedom attributed to Carpocrates stemmed from a core Gnostic understanding of the material world as a flawed creation. Carpocrates reportedly taught that true liberation from these powers required the soul to fully engage with and experience every facet of this earthly existence, encompassing all possible conditions and actions. The underlying logic, as understood by his detractors, was that by exhaustively encountering the spectrum of human experience, the soul would ultimately transcend the limitations and influences imposed by the archons, rendering their laws and the perceived distinctions between good and evil within their creation irrelevant. This doctrine was vehemently condemned by early Christian writers who interpreted it as a dangerous justification for unrestrained and immoral behavior. They viewed the idea of needing to experience everything as a license to commit any sin, arguing that it would lead to societal breakdown and the corruption of individuals, while the Church Fathers presented this as a literal call to engage in all forms of vice. Some modern scholars speculate that Carpocrates' intent might have been more symbolic or focused on an internal process of understanding the full range of human nature and the illusory nature of earthly distinctions, rather than a literal prescription for immoral acts. Nevertheless, this radical interpretation of spiritual freedom remains a central and controversial aspect of Carpocrates' legend. Like many Gnostic groups, the Carpocratians held a distinctive view of the divine and the origins of the material world, which directly influenced their rejection of the Old Testament law. From this perspective, the laws laid down in the Old Testament were not seen as originating from the true benevolent God, but rather as the dictates of these inferior material-bound powers. The alleged communal practices of the Carpocratians represented a direct assault on the deeply entrenched social and moral structures of the Roman world. The concept of communal wives, as reported by their detractors, struck at the heart of the patriarchal Roman family and the emerging Christian emphasis on monogamy and marital fidelity. Similarly, any suggestion of communal ownership of property would have challenged the fundamental Roman legal and social order based on private ownership. These radical departures from established norms were not merely theological disagreements, they were seen as a direct threat to the stability and cohesion of society, contributing significantly to the widespread condemnation of the Carpocratian sect by both pagan and Christian authorities. The Carpocratians' alleged transgressions against social norms were intertwined with a broader rejection of various forms of law. Their antinomian stance, as reported by the Church Fathers, implied a disregard for both moral and civil laws, stemming from a belief that their spiritual enlightenment placed them beyond such earthly constraints. This comprehensive rejection of legal and social norms, whether accurately portrayed or exaggerated by their opponents, positioned the Carpocratians as radical outliers within the religious and social landscape of the 2nd century, solidifying their image as controversial figures who dared to defy the established order in pursuit of their unique spiritual understanding. The core of the controversy surrounding Carpocrates and his followers centers on the accusation of Antinomianism. This doctrine, fundamentally opposed to the concept of being bound by law, permeated their alleged beliefs and practices, causing significant scandal and condemnation within the early church and the broader Roman society. The Carpocratians purportedly held that their attainment of spiritual enlightenment elevated them beyond the need to adhere to conventional morality. The assertion attributed to Carpocrates that nothing is evil by nature strikes at the heart of conventional morality and provides a potential philosophical justification for the libertine actions his followers were accused of. The stance suggests a radical relativism, where concepts of good and evil are not inherent truths, but rather subjective human opinion or societal constructs. If nothing possesses an intrinsic evil nature, then actions typically condemned as immoral by wider society could be reinterpreted as simply different forms of experience devoid of any fundamental wrongness. This philosophical underpinning could have been used by the Carpocratians to rationalize their alleged engagement in any and all deeds, sinful or otherwise. If moral distinctions are merely human constructs, then the pursuit of diverse experiences, as reportedly advocated by Carpocrates for spiritual liberation, would not be inherently problematic. This viewpoint directly challenges the developing Orthodox Christian understanding of divinely ordained moral laws and the inherent sinfulness of certain actions. By dissolving the absolute nature of good and evil, Carpocrates' reported philosophy provided a framework that could seemingly justify behaviors that scandalized his contemporaries and fueled the accusations of libertinism against his followers. The belief attributed to Carpocrates that achieving full experience was necessary for the soul's liberation presents a radical and controversial perspective on the spiritual journey. Within the Gnostic framework, the material world and its laws were often seen as hindrances to spiritual ascent, created and maintained by the lesser archons. Carpocrates reportedly taught that to overcome these limitations and break the cycle of reincarnation, the soul needed to encounter and comprehend the full spectrum of earthly existence. This implied that no experience, regardless of its moral implications within conventional societal norms, should be avoided. By engaging with all facets of the material realm, the soul would supposedly exhaust its attachment to it and become indifferent to the archon's power. This doctrine, as interpreted by its critics, presented a significant challenge to established moral and ethical frameworks. The idea that sin and transgression could be pathways to liberation was seen as a dangerous and perverse justification for immoral behavior. The Church Fathers argued that such a belief would lead to societal chaos and the abandonment of all virtuous conduct. It's important to consider that our understanding of this doctrine comes primarily from those who vehemently opposed Carpocratian Gnosticism. It is possible that the concept of full experience held a symbolic meaning within their community, perhaps referring to a comprehensive understanding of human nature rather than a literal mandate for unrestrained action. Nevertheless, the accusation of promoting such a radical approach to experience remains a key element in the historical portrayal of Carpocrates and his followers. The critical lens through which we view Carpocrates and his teachings is almost exclusively that of early Christian writers who dedicated themselves to identifying, refuting, and condemning what they considered heretical beliefs. Figures like Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Clement of Alexandria, and others provide the vast majority of the information we possess about Carpocrates and the Carpocratians. It is crucial to acknowledge that these individuals were not neutral observers, but rather staunch defenders of what they perceived as Orthodox Christianity. They had a clear, vested interest in portraying Gnostic groups as dangerous threats to the true faith and the moral order. This inherent bias significantly impacts our understanding of Carpocrates. Their accounts were often driven by a biased agenda to demonize Gnostic beliefs, warn their own followers against them, and solidify the boundaries of emerging Christian orthodoxy. Consequently, their descriptions of Carpocratian doctrines and practices may be exaggerated to appear more scandalous and abhorrent. Accusations of extreme libertinism, such as communal wives and the embrace of all sinful deeds, could have been sensationalized to shock and repel potential adherents. Furthermore, the Church Fathers may have distorted Carpocratian ideas, interpreting them through their own theological framework and failing to grasp the nuances or symbolic meanings within the Gnostic context. Without surviving writings from Carpocrates himself, disentangling accurate reporting from biased exaggeration remains a significant challenge for modern scholars seeking to understand this controversial figure. The Carpocratian emphasis on spiritual freedom and the goal of transcending the material world were central to their beliefs, but these concepts, deeply rooted in a Gnostic worldview that often denigrated the physical world and its creators, could have been easily misconstrued by those operating within different philosophical and religious frameworks. For individuals who did not share the Gnostic understanding of a flawed material creation and the oppressive nature of its rulers, the Carpocratian call to experience all earthly conditions might have sounded like a reckless abandonment of morality rather than a strategic path to spiritual liberation. While Carpocratians might have believed that their enlightened state rendered conventional morality obsolete, those outside this belief system would have perceived this as a dangerous form of moral relativism, potentially justifying selfish or harmful actions. The radical nature of Gnostic cosmology and its implications for human conduct were likely difficult for those adhering to more traditional views of a divinely ordained moral order to comprehend, leading to accusations of libertinism based on what appeared to be a rejection of all established ethical boundaries. While the early church fathers interpreted Carpocrates' call to experience everything as a literal mandate for unrestrained behavior, some modern scholars propose a more nuanced understanding. They suggest that this teaching might have held a symbolic or internal meaning related to achieving a comprehensive understanding of the full spectrum of human existence, both its light and its darkness, its joys and its sorrows, without necessarily requiring direct participation in all possible acts. From this perspective, experiencing everything could be interpreted as a form of intense empathy and intellectual comprehension of the human condition. By deeply contemplating and understanding the full range of human emotions, motivations, and experiences, including those traditionally labeled as sinful, the Gnostic might aim to transcend judgment and achieve a more holistic and detached understanding of the self and the nature of reality. This interpretation aligns with the Gnostic emphasis of inner knowledge and the potential for psychological and spiritual transformation through insight rather than solely through external actions. It suggests that Carpocrates' teachings might have been a radical call for profound self-awareness and a complete grappling with the complexities of human existence within the flawed material world rather than a literal endorsement of libertinism. The legacy of Carpocrates is one shrouded in controversy, largely shaped by the critical accounts of his theological opponents. Accused of rejecting all laws and promoting licentious behavior under the guise of spiritual liberation, the Carpocratians represent a radical strand within Gnostic thought. While the extent and nature of their antinomianism remain debated, with modern scholars suggesting potential symbolic interpretations of the more extreme doctrines, the historical portrayal of Carpocrates as a figure who challenged the very foundation of moral and social order is undeniable. His controversial teachings serve as a stark reminder of the diverse and often unorthodox expressions of spiritual seeking in the ancient world and the complex interplay between individual freedom, divine knowledge, and the constraints of human law.